Zurich, winter of 1963. Snow hangs in the air like static, drifting around the glass roof of the Hauptbahnhof. Inside, the station buzzes with orderly Swiss calm. Train doors hiss, briefcases snap shut, heels tick on polished stone. On platform 3, a man in a dark camel hair coat steps down from a night train from Milan. One gloved hand on the rail, the other clutching a thin leather case. To everyone around him, he is just another businessman, another face among many. To 3 different intelligence services watching from 3 different countries, he is the most important face in the station. Everywhere he walks, metal eyes are waiting. A bank camera staring down from a marble arch, its film slowly spooling. A customs booth camera, its lens just a black dot above a bored official. In the corner of the station concourse, a new experimental overhead camera, installed by cautious police, humming faintly as it records to a locked metal canister. In a hotel 2 blocks away, a lobby camera is already rolling. Its manager has been told a special guest is expected. The man with the camel hair coat is not simply being followed by people. He is being followed by film. Up in a cramped room above the ticket hall, Swiss officers sit around a monitor showing the live feed from the experimental camera, more fascinated by the technology than by the people it captures. In a nearby street, a black Citroën, with diplomatic plates, is parked at a fire hydrant, engine idling, exhaust steaming. 2 men inside watch the clock on the dashboard. Their second hand is tied to the station's big clock outside. When the hands line up at 12 and 12, they will start counting down. They have exactly 7 minutes. The man in the camel hair coat checks his watch, glances at the departures board, and turns toward the customs corridor. He does not know that beneath his shoes, in a service tunnel, a Mossad technician is crouched next to a junction box with a bundle of clipped wires, listening to the same ticking station clock. He does not know that another man, dressed as a janitor, is leaning on a mop beside the customs camera, his thumb resting on a concealed switch that can kill the power to the lens with a single press. He does not know that in a basement across town, a woman in a lab coat is standing beside 3 identical film canisters, ready to swap them the moment the station calls. If this fails, it will not simply be an operational embarrassment. The target is tied to money routes that snake from European banks into hostile armies on Israel's borders. If he survives, and if anyone can prove that Israeli hands touched him on neutral Swiss soil, there will be diplomatic firestorms in Bern, in Washington, in Moscow. If it succeeds, there will be nothing at all. No photographs of his last walk across the station, no grainy still frame for newspapers to print, no claim or denial that can ever be checked against images. Just a man who stepped off a train and into the thin winter air, and then slipped out of every camera on Earth. The Citroën's clock clicks to the top of the hour. In the cramped service tunnel, the technician whispers into a throat microphone, "All posts. Begin." Above them, the man in the camel hair coat walks under the first camera. The film turns. The second hand moves. Somewhere, a switch is pressed, and for 7 minutes, the world's lenses go blind. To the clerk at the bank in Milan, he was Mr. Elias Rahman, a courteous client who always wore carefully pressed suits and brought Swiss chocolate for the tellers. To the concierge at the Zurich hotel, where he stayed every other month, he was a repeat guest who tipped modestly, never drank, and always asked for the same corner room overlooking the river. To his younger sister back in Alexandria, he was the brother who sent foreign toys for her children and avoided questions about his work with a tired smile. None of them knew that Elias Rahman was not his real name, and the man who had just stepped off the train carried more than a leather case. He carried the outlines of a secret war. He had been born far from Zurich's glass and marble. In the late 1930s, in a small house on a narrow street in Haifa, a boy named Eliyahu Rice learned to repair radios, taking apart German sets and piecing them together again with improvised parts. War and politics twisted his path. After battles and borders shifted, after his family fractured and he disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe, the boy who loved frequencies and dials emerged on the other side of the continent with a new name and a new loyalty. In Munich, he studied engineering, the language of circuits and signal interference, becoming more natural to him than any mother tongue. By the mid-1950s, Rahman had found the perfect niche in a dangerous marketplace. Arab states rebuilding their armies after humiliating defeats needed equipment, radar, and advisors. Soviet officers needed middlemen who could move money into discreet European banks and ship hardware without leaving fingerprints. Rahman built a bridge between them. He handled accounts for ministries in Cairo and Damascus, managed shell companies that bought spare parts for missile systems, and set up insurance for ships that would never sail along the routes they declared. He was not a general or a politician. He was more dangerous. He was the man who made other people's power possible. To his clients in Cairo, he was known as the fixer, the one who could open accounts in Switzerland with a phone call and ensure that weapons shipments never stalled at customs. To a small department inside Israeli intelligence, he had another nickname whispered in late-night briefings: the lens. They called him that not because he was easy to see, but because everything flowed through him. If they could bend him, they could bend the entire picture of who financed what and where. He was a problem for Israel in two different ways. Financially, he kept money flowing toward armies that had already fought one war with Israel and were preparing for the next. Operationally, he knew too much. Over the years, sitting in discreet bank offices and smoky back rooms, he had watched senior officers relax, talk, boast about their plans. He had memorized routing numbers and real names behind code phrases. In his head, he carried a living map of hostile networks, and that map could be sold to anyone who offered enough protection and cash. Another Arab government, a European service, even the Soviets. At first, Israeli analysts tried to follow him from a distance, tracking corporate registrations and shipping manifests, hoping to stay ahead of the flows he managed. But as the stakes rose and rumors surfaced that Rahman was considering shifting his allegiance to a rival side for a higher fee, the calculus changed. Leaving him untouched meant letting an enemy banker roam freely through neutral territory, buying influence and time for Israel's opponents. Killing him would cut off a vital artery of money, but it would also close the only living archive of those networks. The perfect solution, on paper, would be to capture him and make him talk. The problem was that in the world Rahman lived in, cameras were everywhere, and cameras told stories to newspapers and parliaments that governments could not always control. The file that turned a businessman into a target was thin at first. In the autumn of 1961, a young analyst in Tel Aviv placed a slim folder labeled Rahman Elias on the corner of a crowded table during a meeting at Mossad headquarters. The director did not even glance at it until the room had half emptied. Inside were copies of bank registrations, photographs taken from across streets in Rome and Zurich, and a memo summarizing his connections to arms procurement for Egypt and Syria. At the bottom, handwritten in the analyst's neat script, was a simple line: "Subject is not a soldier. Subject is infrastructure." That word changed the discussion. Infrastructure meant he was not just another man at a desk. He was a bridge others walked across. Taking him out would not be an isolated act. It would be a blow to a wider structure. Over the next months, as reports stacked up showing weapons purchased through Rahman's networks ending up on borders Israel could not afford to lose, the folder thickened. So did the tension in the rooms where his name was spoken. The decision did not belong only to case officers. It moved upward, across the city to the low stone buildings where ministers argued over budgets and borders. The intelligence chiefs presented two options: neutralize the banker or neutralize the flows he managed by flipping him. The Prime Minister, remembering earlier scandals when operations in Europe had gone wrong and left Israeli fingerprints on front pages, was wary. A misstep in a neutral country like Switzerland could bring economic and diplomatic retaliation that might cost more than one financier was worth. Defense officials countered with maps and projections of future wars, showing how much blood his quiet work might eventually spill. Internal debates dragged on through late 1962. Some argued for a quiet assassination in a place where it could be passed off as an accident, a heart attack in a hotel, a car that missed a turn in the Alps. Others urged a classic snatch: grab him, fly him to a safe house, and see how long his resolve lasted in a windowless room. The risk, always, was exposure. Cameras in lobbies, on streets, at border crossings, combined with the curiosity of small-town policemen, had already complicated other European operations. The Swiss, proud of their neutrality, allowed foreign powers to whisper in their banks, but not to spill blood in their streets. It was a small technical proposal that shifted the argument. An engineer from a lesser-known unit within the service, invited to a planning session almost as an afterthought, laid out an idea that sounded like something from a crime novel. If the problem was cameras, perhaps the cameras could be made to lie. Analog film could be fogged, swapped, replaced. Experimental systems could be malfunctioned at the crucial moment. If, in the narrow window when Rahman moved from train to customs to street, every device that could record his image either failed or captured something else, there would be no proof for any government to wave in another's face. We do not only remove the man, the engineer said quietly, we remove his picture. The concept fascinated the director. It also offered a layer of political insulation. If the operation ended with angry phone calls and questions in Switzerland's parliament, but no photographs to feed the press, denials would be easier. The code name came next, chosen by someone in the technical unit with a taste for dark humor: Operation Negative Image. Internally, it was described in chillingly clinical language as a coordinated multi-node disruption of visual evidence concurrent with the capture of a financial asset. By early spring of 1963, the decision was signed. Rahman's name moved from an analytical file to the active target list. His photograph, clipped from a hotel registration card, was pinned to a corkboard in a secure room in Tel Aviv, with red string linking it to bank logos and silhouettes of Soviet missiles. A single-line summary beneath it captured the cold logic of what was to follow. Subject's elimination or capture will reshape enemy logistics. Operation must leave no visual trace on neutral soil. Long before the Citroën idled outside the Zurich station, Rahman's life had been broken into movements on maps and lines in ledgers. For almost 2 years, small teams followed him without ever getting close enough to risk spooking the man who lived off noticing things others missed. They watched not only where he went, but how he moved. They learned that he hated airports and only flew when absolutely necessary, preferring overnight trains with predictable schedules. They discovered that he favored cities where finance and discretion overlapped: Zurich, Geneva, Milan, Vienna. He treated each like a carefully chosen instrument in an orchestra of money. In Zurich, the pattern was especially tight. He would arrive on a morning train, always second or third class despite his income, carrying no luggage beyond his briefcase. He would walk the same route from the platform to customs, nodding to the same bored guard, pass under the same heavy camera bolted above the corridor, and emerge into the hall with its giant clock. From there, he had 2 destinations, alternating like notes in a melody. On one visit, he would cross the street to a particular bank with a lion carved above its doors, disappearing into a private office and emerging an hour later with nothing visible changed, but everything subtly altered in accounts across 3 continents. On the next visit, he would take a tram 2 stops to his preferred hotel, check in, make 2 phone calls from the lobby, and then vanish upstairs until evening. They logged his habits in detail: which coat he wore in which season, how often he checked his watch, the small ritual in which he smoothed the cuffs of his sleeves before entering a bank manager's office, as if resetting himself. They watched how his clients' couriers approached him, always keeping a polite distance in public, never greeting him by name. They noted that he never sat with his back to a door, that he always chose cafe tables with a view of both entrance and street. He trusted neutral territory and friends in high financial places, but not much else. The weak points were subtle. One was time. For all his caution, Rahman had a tight schedule. He liked to complete his business by early afternoon and return to his train in daylight, avoiding late-night shadows. That compressed his movements into predictable windows that could be calculated down to minutes. Another weak point was technology. The cameras installed in Zurich station, banks, and hotels were new, symbols of modern security that impressed clients. They were also fallible machines. They needed maintenance. Film had to be developed across town in a single lab under contract, and their operators were humans who could be charmed or bribed. Israeli officers, working through cutouts, and intermediaries quietly map the entire chain of custody for every photographic image their target might appear in. They learned which private company had installed the station's experimental overhead system, who serviced the customs corridor camera, which bank insisted on keeping its own film locked in a vault, and which hotel sent its reels to the same overworked technician alongside wedding films and newsreel scraps. They examined the path a few inches of film traveled from the moment light hit it in the lens to the moment someone viewed it on a screen or projector. They were not just watching where Rahman went, they were watching what he trusted. He trusted that Switzerland's obsession with order would keep trains on time and accounts safe. He trusted that the modern cameras blinking above doors and corridors were there to protect him from petty thieves and suspicious clerks, not as potential witnesses against him in some future inquiry. He trusted that neutral soil meant he stood in a place where great powers would whisper around him, not reach out and touch him. At the same time, other eyes were watching. French and British services, wary of being eclipsed in Middle Eastern affairs, occasionally placed their own watchers near Rahman, hoping to use him as a window into Arab procurement. Rumors circulated that a Soviet residentura in another European capital had attempted, and failed, to recruit him as a direct agent. The more he moved, the more cameras and people he passed under, the more trails he left for different services to follow. Operation Negative Image was built on a simple, ruthless recognition. If those trails were not cut in a single, decisive moment, one day someone else might get to him first, and they would not be shy about showing photographs to the world. In a secure apartment in Tel Aviv, the map of Zurich grew cluttered with pins and annotations until it looked less like a city and more like a circuit board. Each camera along Rahman's path was a component. Each technician, manager, and guard connected to those devices was a potential access point. The team responsible for planning Operation Negative Image worked backwards from the moment the target stepped off the train, calculating not just how to reach him, but how to suffocate the evidence of reaching him. The choice of location was deliberate. Zurich offered a density of cameras but a narrow, controllable arena. The station, customs corridor, street, bank, and hotel formed a loop that could be mapped in seconds and walked in minutes. Unlike sprawling airports, which spanned multiple jurisdictions, the areas that mattered here fell under a few authorities, and crucially, relied on a single private contractor for most of their camera maintenance. That contractor, a modest family-owned firm proud of its role in bringing modern security to Swiss institutions, became the quiet center of the planning. Under non-Israeli cover, a pair of operatives posed as representatives of a foreign firm looking to invest in European security technology. Over dinners and casual meetings, they got close to the company's founder and his key technician, listening more than talking, flattering their expertise. A small consulting contract followed, nominally to advise on expanding to new markets. In reality, it gave the operatives access to schematics, service schedules, and, eventually, keys and codes. From there, carefully compartmentalized, the Mossad technicians built a model of the camera systems that would be active on the operational day, how long their films ran before needing replacement, what kind of power they drew, where their cables ran in the walls and under the floors. The method selected for the capture was as much about perception as it was about mechanics. Killing Rahman in the station would create a scene. Even a quiet collapse at a cafe could lead to questions, autopsies, and a public paper trail. Spiriting him away alive offered more operational value, but only if it could be done without leaving the impression that anything had happened at all. The planners settled on a hybrid approach. The man would walk into a space watched by cameras, pass briefly through a blind spot created in real time, and emerge no longer as himself, but as a decoy who could be allowed to drift into obscurity. The unit chosen to execute the plan was composed of operatives with experience in Europe, comfortable in tailored suits and snow, who could pass for businessmen, tourists, or diplomats as needed. A small technical cell traveled separately, carrying innocuous-looking equipment, modified junction boxes, magnetic devices that could fog film without visible damage, and custom tools designed to open and reseal camera housings without leaving marks. Their covers were layered. A consultant in town to review a bank's security, a janitor hired by the station at short notice to cover a sick worker, a photographic assistant visiting the film lab. Rehearsals played out far from Switzerland, in a mocked-up corridor in a training facility where cameras were mounted at the same height and angles as in Zurich. They practiced the timing needed to kill and restore power without drawing attention. Drilled the sequence of switching film canisters in a simulated lab while a clock counted down on the wall. They rehearsed contingencies. What if customs pulled Raman into a back office for extra questions? What if a curious tourist started filming with a small home movie camera? What if a random technical fault brought station electricians into their carefully planned maintenance tunnel at the wrong time? Every what if was matched with a quiet exit route and a cover story. The tools extended beyond gadgets. Identities were weapons, too. A Swiss-German speaker with impeccable forged credentials would play the role of a regional maintenance supervisor able to wave away questions from station staff. A woman posing as an assistant at the film lab would arrive the day before the operation, bringing friendly pastries and efficiency that would make the overworked technician willing to accept her help with sorting the reels. An insurance inspector would schedule a visit to the bank, coinciding with the operation and giving plausible reason for cameras to be opened and briefly checked. On paper, the plan was almost elegant. Raman's known routine would carry him under cameras whose innards had already been touched and tamed. At a predetermined point on his walk, those cameras would either stop recording, record only noise, or, in the case of the experimental overhead system, capture an image subtly altered enough to be useless. The blind window would last no more than 7 minutes, a gap small enough to be blamed later on technical hiccups. Inside that window, a man would be intercepted, switched with another wearing his coat and carrying a lighter case, and moved into a vehicle whose departure would look utterly normal. If anything broke that pattern, the hard rule was simple: abort and reset. Better to leave a dangerous man walking than to leave a single incriminating frame of film. The morning chosen for Operation Negative Image was clear and brittle. The kind of winter day when sound carries and breath smokes in front of faces. In the station, few people paid attention to the new janitor mopping near the customs corridor, his bucket placed just so beneath the camera housing. Even fewer noticed the man in a suit checking his watch near the electrical room, a leather folder tucked under his arm marking him as some kind of inspector. On a street 2 blocks away, the woman from the film lab walked briskly toward her workplace, a paper bag of croissants in hand and false identification papers in her pocket, rehearsing the names of colleagues she had studied from stolen records. Raman's train slid into the station almost to the minute, as it always did. As he stepped down to the platform, the overhead camera began its smooth pan, its film catching the first frames of his arrival. At that moment, in the service tunnel, the technician placed a small device against a junction box and flicked a switch. Power to certain circuits dipped so slightly that lights did not flicker, but the camera's motor hiccuped. In the customs corridor, the janitor leaned his shoulder against the wall, thumb pressing a concealed button that interrupted current to the older camera above the booth. Its film continued to move, but the shutter stopped for 10 long seconds. Later, in a dark room, those seconds would look like a strip of overexposed fog. Raman nodded to the customs official, produced the same documents he always did, and passed through, none the wiser. As he entered the concourse, the giant clock showed he still had ample time before his first appointment. His eyes flicked toward the bank's direction, then to the exit, where trams rattled past. He chose, as predicted, the bank. As he moved, a man with a gray hat and similar build detached himself from a newsstand, buying a newspaper and falling into step at a slight distance behind him. The decoy's scarf, coat, and gait had been studied and rehearsed until, on a camera, the two men would be difficult to distinguish. Outside, the Citroën eased away from its hydrant, looping around the block. In the narrow lane between the station and the bank, where delivery trucks idled and few pedestrians bothered to walk, a van marked with a telecommunications logo had been parked since dawn. Inside, 2 operatives sat in silence, listening to the countdown over earpieces. When the voice from the service tunnel reported, "Phase 1 complete, corridors blind," they straightened, hands resting on the door handles. The world above continued to move in its usual rhythm. Trams clanged past. Children laughed over snowballs on the opposite pavement. No one looking down from an office window would have seen anything unusual. The interception itself took less than 30 seconds. As Rahman turned into the lane, cutting toward a staff entrance of the bank he sometimes used, he stepped into the narrowest stretch of path, flanked by a wall and the van. The side doors slid open in a practiced movement. A man stepped out, colliding with him as if by accident, apologies on his lips, in accented German. At the same time, another hand clamped a cloth over Rahman's face, soaked in a fast-acting agent designed not to kill but to erase his consciousness. His knees buckled. From the street, it looked like a sudden fainting spell. Two figures eased him into the van, the door rolled shut, and the vehicle pulled away with calm inevitability, merging into traffic. 5 seconds later, the decoy in the gray hat turned the same corner, adjusted his scarf, and continued along the lane, emerging near the bank's main doors. Anyone piecing together events later from human witness statements would remember a man in a camel hair coat approaching the bank around that time. Any camera that might have fixed his features was either fogged or, in the case of the overhead experimental system, recording a feed that the film lab assistant would slightly mishandle, scratching crucial frames and mislabeling them in the chaos of a busy day. In the hours that followed, the technical team quietly restored normalcy. Power surges were blamed on minor faults. Camera housings were checked in front of local staff, reassuring them that everything was working again. The film lab processed the station's reels as usual, except that the strip covering the crucial 7 minutes was switched with a blank section taken from a test spool. When a station administrator later complained about the missing footage for that interval, the lab manager shrugged and muttered about experimental equipment and teething problems. It was irritating, but not unheard of. Rahman woke up in a different country, in a room with no windows, his coat neatly hung on a chair, his briefcase on a table. Across from him sat men who knew his real name and far more about his life than he had ever intended anyone to learn. What passed between those walls remained unwritten, sealed in reports read by a handful of officials. In Zurich, the story was shorter and stranger. A businessman had been seen arriving on a morning train. Some thought they saw him walking toward a bank. No one remembered seeing him leave. There were no usable photographs. Without images, rumors remained just that. The diplomatic ripples were muted. There were inquiries from quietly alarmed Swiss officials about foreign operatives using their soil, but with no dramatic corpse on a platform or crime scene photographs to inflame public opinion, the matter stayed confined to closed-door meetings. Arab states whispered among themselves, suspecting foul play but unable to produce a single frame of proof. In intelligence circles, the operation became an uneasy legend. The day a man who had lived his life under the gaze of banks and borders stepped into a European station and, in less than 7 minutes, ceased to exist on any camera. Strategically, the removal of the banker disrupted enemy logistics, forcing ministries in Cairo and Damascus to scramble for new intermediaries. For a time, shipments slowed, accounts froze, and the quiet machinery of war planning creaked. But nature and geopolitics abhor a vacuum. Others rose to fill his place, some less cautious and more ideologically driven, willing to take risks he would have avoided. Erasing one man's image from film did not erase the conflicts that had created him. It did, however, reveal something about the world taking shape in those years, a world where state power was not only about killing enemies, but about controlling which stories could be told about their deaths or disappearances. In the end, the most chilling detail of Operation Negative Image was not the technical finesse or the flawless timing. It was the silence that followed. No dramatic photograph of a face circled in red beneath a headline. No grainy still from a station camera, replayed endlessly on television. Just an absence, a gap in the record, and a question that hangs over every covert act. When governments can not only decide who lives and dies, but also whether there will be any evidence they ever existed in that crucial moment, where does accountability end and permanent shadow begin?